The train lurched to a stop at the snow-covered platform in Greeley, Colorado, and Hannah Osworth stepped down into the brutal February wind of 1882 with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter promising marriage to a man she had never met. The cold bit through her threadbare wool coat immediately, making her gasp as icy air filled her lungs. She had traveled from Philadelphia, leaving behind a city that had nothing left for her after her father's debts consumed everything, and her only brother had died in a factory accident. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like divine providence at the time, a rancher named Gerald Morton seeking a respectable wife to help run his homestead. His letters had been formal but kind, promising security and a fresh start in the Western Territories. Now, standing alone on this desolate platform as the train pulled away with a mournful whistle, Hannah wondered if she had made a catastrophic mistake. She scanned the handful of people scattered around the small station building, searching for someone who might be waiting for her. Gerald had written that he would meet her train without fail, that she should look for a tall man with dark hair and a brown hat. But the platform was nearly empty now, just a few locals hurrying toward the warmth of the station house, and a freight worker rolling barrels toward a wagon. No one approached her. No one even looked her way. Hannah clutched her bag tighter and moved closer to the station building, trying to shield herself from the wind. The temperature had to be well below freezing, and the afternoon sun provided no warmth as it hung weakly in the gray sky. She had been unprepared for this kind of cold. Philadelphia had winters, certainly, but nothing like the savage bite of this Colorado wind that seemed to find every gap in her clothing and freeze her to the bone. Minutes stretched into an hour. Her feet had gone numb in her thin leather boots despite her attempts to stamp feeling back into them. Her fingers ached even inside her gloves. She watched wagon after wagon depart, watched the platform empty completely until she stood utterly alone. The station agent had gone inside and shuttered the ticket window. A few snowflakes began to drift down from the gray sky. Hannah fought against the panic rising in her chest. Perhaps Gerald had been delayed. Perhaps there had been trouble with his livestock or a problem on the ranch. She tried to remember how far his property was from town, but his letters had been vague on such details. 5 miles. 10. 20. In this cold, any distance might as well be the moon. She considered going into the station house to wait, but pride kept her rooted to the spot. She had come all this way, had burned every bridge behind her. She would wait as promised. She had nowhere else to go. The reality of that thought made her throat tighten. If Gerald did not come, she had exactly $4.30 to her name. No friends, no family, and no prospects in this harsh frontier town. Another 30 minutes passed. The snow began to fall more heavily. Hannah's teeth chattered uncontrollably now, and her whole body shook with cold. Her lips felt cracked and her face burned from the wind. She could no longer feel her toes at all. The street in front of the station was nearly empty, most sensible people having sought shelter from the worsening weather. She was beginning to think she might actually freeze to death right here on this platform. Just another foolish Eastern woman who had ventured west unprepared, when she heard the sound of boots on the wooden planks behind her. "Miss, you cannot be standing out here in this cold." The voice was deep and rough, touched with concern. Hannah turned stiffly, her body reluctant to move, and found herself looking up at a man who seemed to have materialized from the swirling snow itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. What she could see of his features showed a strong jaw dark with stubble, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like sage in morning light. "I am waiting for someone," Hannah managed through chattering teeth. Her voice sounded thin and desperate even to her own ears. The man stepped closer, his expression darkening as he took in her inadequate clothing and the trembling that shook her entire frame. "How long have you been standing here?" The train arrived at 1:30. She tried to sound composed, but another violent shiver ran through her. He glanced at his pocket watch and his jaw tightened. "That was nearly 2 hours ago. You will get frostbite or worse. Who are you waiting for?" "A gentleman named Gerald Morton. I am to be his wife." The words felt strange on her frozen lips. "He was supposed to meet my train." Something flickered across the cowboy's face, an emotion Hannah could not quite read in her increasingly foggy state of mind. He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I know Gerald Morton." Hope flared in her chest. "Can you tell me where to find him? Perhaps there has been some confusion about the day." The man removed his hat, revealing dark auburn hair that curled slightly at his collar. His expression was troubled. "Miss, I am sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Gerald Morton was killed 4 days ago. His horse threw him crossing an icy creek, broke his neck. We buried him yesterday." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Hannah heard the words, understood them individually, but could not make sense of them together. Dead. Gerald Morton was dead. The man she had traveled across the country to marry, the man who represented her only hope for a future, was dead and buried. "I see." Her voice came from very far away. "I see. Thank you for informing me." She tried to think what to do next. She should go inside the station. She should ask about return trains to Philadelphia. But Philadelphia was impossible. She had no money for a ticket. She had no home waiting there anyway. The landlord had evicted her from her tiny room the day before she left, and she had sold what little furniture she possessed to pay for her train fare west. "Miss, are you all right?" The cowboy's voice seemed to echo strangely. Yes, of course. But she was not all right. Nothing was all right. The platform tilted again and she swayed, her vision darkening at the edges. Strong hands caught her before she fell. The cowboy swept her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. "You are frozen half to death," he said, his voice rough with some emotion she could not identify. "We need to get you warm immediately." Hannah knew she should protest. It was not proper for a strange man to carry her. But she was so cold, and his chest was so warm even through his heavy coat, and she was so very tired. She let her head rest against his shoulder and closed her eyes. "What is your name?" he asked as he strode toward the street. "Hannah Osworth." "I am Thomas Keller. I run a ranch about 8 miles north of town." His arms tightened around her slightly. "Listen to me, Hannah. You are going to be all right, I promise you that. You will never be alone again." The words should have frightened her, coming from a stranger, but instead they settled over her like a warm blanket. She managed to open her eyes enough to see his face, set with determination as he carried her through the snow. He had kind eyes, she thought. Worried eyes. "I do not have anywhere to go," she whispered. "Yes, you do. You are coming home with me." Hannah knew this was highly irregular, knew that going home with a strange man was dangerous and improper. But the alternative was freezing to death on the platform, or throwing herself on the mercy of a town that did not know her. At least Thomas Keller had warm arms and had made her a promise. At least he had not left her standing alone in the snow. "There will be talk," she managed to say. "Let them talk. First we keep you alive, then we worry about propriety." He carried her to a horse hitched outside a mercantile, a sturdy bay gelding that stamped nervously as they approached. Thomas lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she were a child, then swung up behind her. He wrapped his coat around them both, tucking her against his chest, and urged the horse into a quick trot. The ride was a blur of cold and snow and the warmth of the man behind her. Hannah drifted in and out of awareness. conscious mainly of the steady beat of Thomas's heart against her back, and the firm arm he kept locked around her waist, holding her secure. He spoke to her occasionally, his voice vibrating through his chest, asking her to stay awake, telling her they were nearly there. When they finally arrived at the ranch, full darkness had fallen and the snow was coming down in thick curtains. Thomas dismounted and pulled her down after him, then carried her straight into the house. It was a simple but solid structure, a single large room with a kitchen area at one end and a stone fireplace at the other. A stairway led up to what must be a sleeping loft. Everything was neat and clean, if sparsely furnished. Thomas laid her on a braided rug in front of the fireplace and immediately set about building up the fire. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, beginning to push back the cold. He filled a kettle and hung it over the fire, then turned his attention back to Hannah. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "Your skirts are soaked through from the snow." Hannah's frozen brain struggled to process this. That would not be proper. "Neither is dying of exposure." His tone was gentle but firm. "I will be a perfect gentleman, I swear it, but these wet things have to come off." Too cold and exhausted to argue, Hannah let him help her out of her coat and untie her boots. Her fingers were too numb to work the buttons on her dress. Thomas ended up having to do it himself, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft with the small fastenings. He kept his eyes carefully averted as he worked, his jaw set in concentration. He left her in her chemise and petticoats, wrapping her instead in what seemed like every blanket he owned. Then he made her sit in a chair pulled close to the fire and knelt to examine her feet and hands. "Wiggle your toes for me," he commanded. Hannah tried. After a moment, pins and needles began shooting through her feet, painful but welcome. At least she could feel them again. Thomas rubbed her feet gently between his hands, warming them carefully. The same painful tingling began in her fingers. "You are lucky," he said. "No frostbite, just very cold. Another hour out there and it would have been a different story." He made her drink hot tea laced with honey, and something stronger that burned going down but spread warmth through her chest. Then he prepared a simple meal of beef stew that had been simmering on the back of the stove, clearly his own dinner. Hannah ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, her mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. Thomas sat across from her at the rough wooden table, his own meal untouched, watching her with those steady gray-green eyes. Finally, when she had finished eating, he spoke. "Tell me what happened. How did you come to be Gerald Morton's mail-order bride?" So Hannah told him. About her father's death and the debts, about her brother's accident at the textile mill, about having no other family and no means of support, about the advertisement and Gerald's letters and the promise of a new life in Colorado. "I know it was foolish," she finished, "agreeing to marry a complete stranger, but I truly had no other options." Thomas shook his head. "It was not foolish, it was brave. Women come west like that all the time, looking for a fresh start. You could not have known what would happen." "What was he like?" "Gerald Morton," Thomas considered the question. "I did not know him well. He kept to himself mostly. His ranch bordered mine to the east. He seemed like a decent enough man, though there were rumors he drank too much. I saw him in town occasionally." He paused, then added carefully, "I will not speak ill of the dead, but I will say this. I do not think he would have made you happy. He was hard and bitter. Lost his first wife to cholera 5 years back and never recovered from it." Hannah absorbed this information numbly. She had traveled across the country to marry a bitter drunk. Perhaps his death had been a mercy in disguise, though she felt guilty for thinking it. "What will I do now?" The question escaped before she could stop it, her voice breaking on the last word. Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and rough with calluses. "Tonight, you will sleep and get warm. Tomorrow, we will figure out the rest. I cannot impose on your hospitality. It is not right." "You are not imposing. I invited you here." His eyes were steady on hers. "Hannah, I meant what I said at the station. You will never be alone again. I do not make promises lightly." There was something in his voice that made her throat tighten. This stranger had more kindness in his eyes than anyone she had known in years. "Why are you helping me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "5 years ago I lost someone. My fiancée, Rebecca. She caught pneumonia one winter and was gone within a week. I know what it is like to be alone. I would not wish that on anyone." "I am sorry for your loss." He nodded acknowledgement. "It was a long time ago, but it taught me that life is fragile and uncertain. When you have a chance to help someone, you do it. No questions asked." That night, Thomas insisted Hannah take the bed in the loft while he slept downstairs by the fire. She was too exhausted to argue. She climbed the narrow stairs wrapped in blankets and found a comfortable bed with a thick quilt. Through the floorboards, she could hear Thomas moving around below, banking the fire and settling in for the night. As she drifted off to sleep in this strange place, with a strange man sleeping below, Hannah found herself thinking that perhaps not everything was lost after all. Perhaps there was still hope in this harsh land. Perhaps Thomas Keller's promise had not been empty words. She slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months. Morning came with pale sunlight streaming through the loft window. The storm had passed, leaving everything outside blanketed in fresh snow. Hannah lay still for a moment, momentarily disoriented, before the events of yesterday came rushing back. She sat up slowly, relieved to find that her body no longer ached with cold. She felt stiff and tired, but warm and alive. Her dress had been draped over a chair near the loft railing, dry now from the heat of the fire below. Someone, Thomas presumably, must have brought it up while she slept. She dressed quickly, finger combing her long brown hair and pinning it up as best she could without a mirror. When she descended the ladder like stairs, she found Thomas at the stove, cooking breakfast. He turned at the sound of her footsteps and offered a small smile. "Good morning." "How do you feel?" "Much better, thank you. I cannot thank you enough for your kindness." "No thanks necessary." He gestured to the table. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate eggs and thick slices of bread toasted over the fire, accompanied by strong coffee. It was simple food but delicious, and Hannah was surprised by her own appetite. As they ate, Thomas explained his situation. "I have 200 acres here, about half of it grazing land for cattle. I run about 50 head, sell them in Denver every fall. It is a good living enough for one person. I have 2 horses, some chickens, a milk cow. The house is small but sound." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I built this place myself 5 years ago after Rebecca died. I thought I would find another wife eventually, have a family, but I never seemed to get around to it. The work kept me busy and I suppose I was not ready." Hannah listened, trying to understand where he was going with this. Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "Here is what I am thinking. You came west looking for a husband and a home. I have a home and I could use a wife. Not for romantic reasons," he added quickly. "I am talking about a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience, if you will. You would have security and a place to live. I would have help running the ranch and someone to share the work with. We could start as partners and see where things go from there." Hannah stared at him, her heart pounding. "You are proposing marriage to me? We only met yesterday." "I know it sounds mad." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in rough curls. "But think about it practically. You have no money and nowhere to go. If you stay here as anything other than my wife, the town will tear your reputation to shreds within a week. As my wife, you would be respectable, protected. But you do not know anything about me. I could be a terrible person." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "Could you? No, but you do not know that. I know you are honest enough to point out that I do not know you. I know you are brave enough to travel halfway across the country alone for a chance at a better life. I know you did not complain once yesterday, even though you had every right to." He leaned forward slightly. "I am a good judge of character, Hannah. I can see enough to know you are a decent person. The rest we can learn as we go." Hannah's mind whirled. Yesterday morning she had been on a train, preparing to meet one stranger and marry him. Now she was being proposed to by a different stranger in a completely different circumstance. It should have felt wrong, but somehow it did not. Thomas was offering her exactly what she had come west looking for: security, a home, a purpose. And unlike Gerald Morton, who she had never met and who was by all accounts a bitter man, she had at least spent an evening with Thomas. She had seen his kindness, his steady strength. "What would you expect from me?" she asked carefully. "As your wife." Thomas held her gaze steadily. "Help with the house and the cooking, the chickens and the garden in summer, maybe help with the cattle when needed, company in the evenings, respect and honesty." He paused. "I would not expect you to share my bed unless and until you wanted to. We would start as partners, like I said, friends, hopefully. Anything beyond that would have to develop naturally. And if it does not, if we never feel that way about each other, then we would have a partnership and a friendship, which is more than many married couples have." He said it simply, as though it were obvious. Hannah turned the idea over in her mind. What were her alternatives? She could try to find work in Greeley, but jobs for women were scarce and poorly paid. She could attempt to return east, but to what? She had nothing waiting for her there. Or she could accept Thomas's offer and at least have security and a chance at building something real. "I am a hard worker," she heard herself say. "I can cook and clean and sew. I know a bit about gardening, though I have never kept chickens or worked with cattle. I will teach you what you need to know. I have no dowry, no money at all really, just what is in my carpet bag. I do not need your money. I need a partner." She looked at him, this man who had appeared out of a snowstorm and made her a promise, who had carried her to warmth and safety without asking for anything in return, who was now offering her a future when she had thought all futures were closed to her. "All right," she said softly. "Yes, I will marry you." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a subtle softening around his eyes. "You are sure?" "I am sure. As sure as I can be about anything right now." He nodded slowly, then extended his hand across the table. "Then we have an agreement. Partners." Hannah placed her hand in his and they shook, sealing the bargain. His grip was warm and firm, and she felt a strange flutter in her chest that she attributed to nerves and relief. "I will ride into town this morning and speak to Reverend Patterson," Thomas said. "If he is agreeable, we can be married this afternoon. The sooner we make this official, the better, before gossip starts spreading." "That quickly? Is there any reason to wait?" Hannah could not think of one. She was already living under his roof. Every hour they delayed made the situation more scandalous. "No, I suppose not." "Good." Thomas stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes. "You should probably go through your things and see what you need. I will give you money for supplies when we go to town. You will need warmer clothes for certain, a proper winter coat and boots. I cannot let you spend your money on me before we are even married." He turned and gave her a look that was almost amused. "Hannah, in a few hours we will be married. My money will be your money. Get used to it." She felt herself flush slightly but nodded. This would take some adjusting to, this idea that she was no longer entirely on her own. that someone was willing to share their resources with her, to care for her welfare. Thomas saddled his horse and rode toward town, leaving Hannah alone in the ranch house. She used the time to thoroughly explore her new home. The main room was perhaps 20 feet by 30, with the kitchen area at one end featuring a good iron stove, a dry sink with a pump, and shelves lined with dishes and supplies. The rest of the room held the fireplace, 2 chairs, the table, a dresser, and a small bookshelf with perhaps a dozen well-worn volumes. Everything was clean and orderly, clearly the domain of a man who took pride in his space. The loft above held the bed, a chest of drawers, and a small wardrobe. A single window looked out over the snowy landscape. It was all simple and practical, without any feminine touches or decorations, but it was solid and well built. Hannah found herself imagining how it might look with curtains at the windows, maybe a braided rug, some of her own possessions scattered around to make it feel lived in. She unpacked her carpet bag, spreading her meager belongings on the bed. 2 changes of clothes, both as worn and inadequate as what she was wearing, some undergarments, a hairbrush and a few pins, a small Bible her mother had given her before she died, a tintype photograph of her family taken years ago when everyone was still alive and they had been, briefly, happy. That was everything she owned in the world. It should have been depressing, but instead, Hannah felt a strange sense of possibility. She was starting completely fresh. She could build a new life here, become a new version of herself. The girl she had been in Philadelphia, ground down by poverty and grief, could stay in the past. Here, she could be someone stronger. Thomas returned around noon with news that Reverend Patterson had agreed to perform the ceremony at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He had also stopped at the Mercantile and spread the word that Gerald Morton's intended bride had arrived not knowing of his death, and that Thomas was marrying her himself to save her from being stranded. It would still cause talk, but this way at least there was an explanation that preserved some propriety. They ate a quick lunch, then Thomas hitched his horse to a small wagon he kept in the barn. Hannah climbed up beside him and they set off for town, the wagon wheels crunching through the snow-packed road. Greeley was a small town, just a collection of buildings clustered around a main street. There was the train station where Hannah had waited yesterday, a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a church, a smithy, and a handful of other businesses. People stopped to stare as Thomas drove the wagon down the main street, and Hannah felt the weight of their curious gazes. First they stopped at the Mercantile, where Thomas introduced her to the proprietor, Mr. Jameson, a balding man with sharp eyes and a warm smile. "My future wife," Thomas said simply, his hand resting lightly on Hannah's back. "She needs warmer clothing." For the next hour, Hannah tried on coats and boots while Thomas conferred with Mr. Jameson on other supplies. She felt guilty about the expense, but Thomas waved away her concerns. "You will earn your keep," he said, "and you cannot do that if you freeze to death." She ended up with a heavy wool coat lined with flannel, fur-lined boots, 2 new dresses of sturdy calico, warm stockings, and various other necessities. Thomas paid without blinking, then added fabric for her to sew more clothes with, needles and thread, and several other items Hannah had not even thought to request. At 10 minutes before 3, they walked to the small white church at the end of the main street. Reverend Patterson met them at the door, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. Mr. Jameson and his wife accompanied them, serving as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and simple. Hannah stood beside Thomas in front of the plain wooden altar and repeated the vows that bound them together. Thomas's voice was steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her. When it was her turn, Hannah found her own voice was stronger than she expected. She meant the words, she realized. She might not love Thomas yet, but she already respected him, and she was committed to making this strange arrangement work. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas turned to her with a slightly uncertain expression. The kiss was expected, Hannah knew, but they had not even discussed it. She gave him a small nod, and he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers gently, briefly. It was her first kiss, and while it was not the stuff of romantic poetry, it was warm and not unpleasant. They signed the marriage certificate. Mrs. Patterson produced a small cake she had baked for the occasion, and then it was done. Hannah Osworth was now Hannah Keller, wife of a Colorado rancher, married to a man she had known for less than a day. The sun was setting as they drove back to the ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. Hannah sat close to Thomas on the wagon seat, partly for warmth and partly because it felt right now that they were married. He drove with easy confidence, one hand on the reins, occasionally pointing out landmarks. That cluster of trees there marks the northwest corner of my property. Our property now, I suppose. The creek runs through there, though it is mostly frozen now. Good fishing in the summer. And see that ridge? That is where the cattle shelter when the weather gets bad. Hannah listened, trying to absorb all the information, trying to understand this new world she had entered. Everything felt surreal, like she was living in a dream. 2 days ago she had been in Philadelphia, preparing to board a train. Yesterday she had nearly frozen to death on a platform. Today she was a married woman, driving through the Colorado wilderness toward her new home. When they arrived back at the ranch, Thomas helped her down from the wagon and carried the packages of supplies inside. He built up the fire while Hannah put away their purchases, finding places for her new clothes in the loft and the fabric and sewing supplies in a drawer. They made dinner together, a companionable silence settling between them. Thomas fried potatoes and onions while Hannah made biscuits from the fresh flour they had purchased. It was domestic and ordinary, and yet it felt momentous. This was her life now. This man, this house, this land. After dinner, they sat by the fire. Thomas pulled out a piece of leather and some tools and worked on repairing a bridle, while Hannah took up some mending she had found in the dresser. For a long while neither of them spoke, just sat in the warm firelight doing their separate tasks. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You should know something about me. I am not much of a talker. I spend a lot of time alone and I have gotten used to silence. But that does not mean I do not welcome your company or your conversation. If you want to talk, I am listening." Hannah looked up from her sewing. "I am not much of a talker either, to be honest. My father was a quiet man, and I suppose I learned it from him." Thomas nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "That will work out well then. We can be quiet together." But then he paused, and his expression grew more serious. "There is something else I want to say. About us. About this marriage." He set down the bridle and turned to face her fully. "I know we agreed this would be a practical arrangement, but I want you to know that I take marriage seriously. I meant the vows I spoke today. I will honor them and honor you. You are my wife now, and that means something to me." Hannah felt warmth spread through her chest. "It means something to me too. I will do my best to be a good wife to you, Thomas. I promise." "You already are." He said it simply, as though it were an established fact. "You have been nothing but brave and gracious through this whole mad situation. Most women would have fallen apart by now. I have had practice with difficult situations. I suppose you have." He studied her for a moment. "Tell me something about yourself, something that has nothing to do with hardship or survival, something that makes you happy." Hannah thought about it. It had been so long since she had considered what made her happy. "I like to read," she said finally. Books were my escape when I was younger. I would lose myself in stories and forget about everything else for a while. Thomas's face brightened. There are books here, not many but a few. Help yourself to any of them, and when I go to Denver in the spring, I can buy more if you tell me what you want. Really? You would do that? Of course. What else would I spend money on? He gestured around the simple room. I have everything I need for the ranch. I would rather invest in things that bring joy to the people I care about. The casual way he included her in that category, people he cared about, made Hannah's throat tighten. She bent her head over her mending to hide the sudden emotion in her eyes. When had anyone last cared about her happiness? Her father had loved her, but he had been too broken by her mother's death and his own failures to think about anyone's joy. Her brother had tried, but he had been too young and struggling too much himself. "Thank you," she managed to say. "That means a great deal to me." That night, when it came time for bed, Thomas made up a pallet by the fire without being asked. Hannah climbed to the loft alone, and as she lay in the darkness, she thought about the strange turn her life had taken. She was married. She had a home. She had a husband who seemed genuinely kind and who had asked for nothing from her but partnership and honesty. It was not the romantic love story girls dreamed about, perhaps, but it was real and solid, and after so much loss and uncertainty, that felt like its own kind of miracle. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Hannah woke early and made breakfast while Thomas handled the morning chores, feeding the animals and checking on the cattle. After breakfast, he would teach her the skills she needed to know: how to gather eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, how to milk the cow, her hands awkward at first but gradually learning the steady rhythm, how to recognize which plants in the barn were hay and which were straw, and what each was used for. Hannah proved to be a quick learner, and Thomas was a patient teacher. He never made her feel foolish for not knowing things, just explained calmly and demonstrated until she understood. In turn, Hannah took over the cooking and cleaning, tasks she was already skilled at, and began to make the house more of a home. She sewed curtains from the fabric Thomas had bought, added small touches that softened the stark masculine space. In the evenings, after dinner was cleared away, they would sit by the fire. Sometimes Hannah would read aloud from one of the books on the shelf, her voice filling the quiet room while Thomas worked on various tasks with his hands. Sometimes they would just talk, sharing stories of their pasts, learning each other's history. Hannah learned that Thomas had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers. His family had been farmers, and he had come west after Rebecca's death looking for a fresh start. He had chosen Colorado for its open land and opportunities, had filed his homestead claim, and built everything himself with determination and hard work. Thomas learned that Hannah had grown up in a genteel but impoverished household, that her father had been a clerk who dreamed of being a writer but never managed to sell his stories, that her mother had died of consumption when Hannah was 12, and that she had essentially raised her younger brother after that, that she loved music but had never learned to play an instrument, loved art but had never been able to afford lessons, loved learning but had only attended school through the 8th grade. "There is so much of the world I have never experienced," she confessed, one evening. "So much I wanted to do and learn and see, but there was never money or time or opportunity." Thomas looked thoughtful. "We have time now. I cannot give you grand tours of Europe or anything like that, but I can teach you things. I can show you this land, and we can learn new things together." It was a different kind of promise than the romantic declarations in the novels Hannah had read, but it felt more real, more possible. They were building something together, brick by brick, day by day. 3 weeks after their wedding, a Chinook wind came through and melted much of the snow. The temperature rose dramatically, and suddenly it felt almost like spring even though it was still February. Thomas decided to ride out and check the full extent of his property, make sure the cattle had weathered the winter storms well. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked Hannah over breakfast. "It is a long ride, but the weather is good and I could show you the ranch properly." Hannah agreed immediately, eager to see more of the land that was now her home. She had barely left the immediate area around the house since arriving. Thomas saddled both horses, and they set out mid-morning, riding side by side across the thawing prairie. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. The land rolled away in every direction, covered in brown grass emerging from melting snow. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose up in jagged peaks, their tops still white with snow. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air was cold but not brutal. Thomas pointed out the boundaries of their land, showed her where the creek ran and where the best grazing was. They found the cattle clustered in a sheltered valley, all accounted for and looking healthy. Thomas rode through them, his experienced eye checking for any signs of illness or injury. They stopped for lunch on a rise that overlooked the entire valley. Thomas had brought bread and cheese and dried meat, and they sat on a flat rock eating and looking out over the land. "It is beautiful," Hannah said. "Wild and lonely, but beautiful. That is a good way to describe it." Thomas pulled off his hat and let the wind ruffle his hair. "I love this land. It can be harsh, but it is honest. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. Work hard, respect it, and it will sustain you. That seems fair to me." Hannah understood what he meant. There was something appealing about that honesty after the false gentility of Eastern society, where people smiled to your face while gossiping behind your back, where appearances mattered more than substance. "I think I could learn to love it too," she said. Thomas turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I hope you do. I would like you to be happy here, Hannah, truly happy, not just content." "I am already happier than I have been in a long time," she said honestly. "You have given me safety and purpose. That is more than I dared hope for." He held her gaze for a long moment, and Hannah felt something shift between them, some subtle change she could not quite name. Then Thomas smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his usually serious face, and reached over to squeeze her hand briefly before turning back to his lunch. They rode home in the late afternoon, arriving as the sun was setting. Hannah's body ached from the long ride, unused to so much time in the saddle, but it was a good ache. She felt alive and strong, like she was finally inhabiting her own body instead of just existing in it. That night, she found herself lingering downstairs after Thomas had made up his pallet by the fire. They stood awkwardly for a moment, and then Hannah found herself saying, "You do not have to sleep down here every night. The bed is large enough for 2 people and we are married. It seems foolish for you to be uncomfortable." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured, I am sure. We can put a blanket down the middle if you like, make a barrier, but you should sleep in an actual bed." He studied her face carefully, as though trying to read her true feelings. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "All right, if you are certain." They climbed to the loft together, and it felt momentous in a way Hannah had not quite anticipated. Thomas laid a folded blanket lengthwise down the middle of the bed, a makeshift wall between the 2 sides. They undressed modestly, backs turned, and climbed into their respective sides. Hannah lay rigid at first, intensely aware of Thomas's presence just inches away, separated only by a thin blanket. She could hear his breathing, steady and slow. But gradually she relaxed. There was something comforting about not being alone in the darkness, about the quiet presence of another person. She had slept alone for so long, had faced so many nights afraid and uncertain. This was different. This was safe. "Good night, Hannah," Thomas said softly into the darkness. "Good night, Thomas." She fell asleep to the sound of his breathing and slept more deeply than she had since arriving in Colorado. March arrived with more snow and bitter cold, then warmed again, the weather unpredictable and changeable. Hannah settled more fully into her role as Thomas's wife and partner. She learned to judge the chicken's moods, to coax the milk cow into cooperation, to recognize when the weather was about to turn bad. She sewed new shirts for Thomas and repaired his worn work clothes. She experimented with different recipes, determined to add variety to their meals. Thomas continued to be unfailingly kind and patient, but Hannah began to notice small changes in him as well. He smiled more often. He spoke more freely. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, thoughtful and soft. The barrier blanket in the bed had been quietly removed after the first week, neither of them quite acknowledging it. Now they slept side by side, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. Hannah found she looked forward to that closeness, to the peaceful quiet of lying next to Thomas in the darkness, to the sound of his breathing that lulled her to sleep. One evening in mid-March, a fierce storm rolled in just after sunset. The wind howled around the house and snow fell so thickly that they could not see the barn just 50 yards away. Thomas paced restlessly, worried about the animals, but even he had to admit it was too dangerous to go out in the blizzard. They huddled close to the fire, the temperature in the room dropping despite the roaring flames. Hannah made hot tea and they wrapped themselves in blankets, listening to the wind shriek. "I hate being unable to help them," Thomas muttered, staring into the fire. "The cattle should be all right if they stay in the sheltered valley, but the chickens and the cow in the barn could freeze if this keeps up all night." "They have shelter," Hannah reminded him gently. "You built them a good barn. They will be all right." Thomas nodded, but his jaw remained tight with worry. Hannah acted on instinct, reaching over to take his hand. He looked down at their clasped hands in surprise, then back up at her face. Slowly, he turned his hand to properly hold hers, his thumb rubbing gently over her knuckles. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the fire. It was such a small thing, holding hands, but it felt significant. A crack in the careful distance they had maintained, an acknowledgement of something growing between them. The storm raged all night, but by morning it had blown itself out. Thomas went immediately to check on the animals and returned with relief written all over his face. Everyone had survived the night, cold but unharmed. As winter grudgingly gave way to early spring, Hannah found herself thinking about Thomas in new ways. She noticed the way his hair curled when it needed cutting, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the strength in his hands and the gentleness with which he used them. She found herself looking forward to their evenings by the fire with an eagerness that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with his company. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to kiss him again, properly this time, not the brief ceremonial peck at their wedding. She wondered what it would be like to close the remaining distance between them in bed, to be held in his arms. The thoughts made her blush, but they also made her pulse quicken. One evening in early April, as they sat reading together, Hannah glanced up to find Thomas watching her instead of his own book. Their eyes met and held. Neither of them looked away. "Hannah," Thomas said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." She set down her book, her heart suddenly pounding. "What is it?" He seemed to struggle for words, this man who was usually so calm and certain. "When I married you, I thought we would be partners. Friends, maybe, if we were lucky. I told myself I was content with that it was enough." He paused, and Hannah held her breath. "But it is not enough anymore," Thomas continued. "I have fallen in love with you, completely and hopelessly in love with you. And I know that was not part of our agreement, and I do not want you to feel obligated in any way, but I could not keep pretending." "You deserve to know the truth." Hannah's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "Thomas, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I am not asking for anything to change. I just needed you to know. I needed to be honest with you." She stood up, her book falling forgotten to the floor. Thomas stood as well, uncertainty flickering across his features. Hannah closed the distance between them, reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "You wonderful, impossible man," she whispered. "I love you too. I have been trying to figure out when it happened, but I think it might have been that first day, when you said I would never be alone again, and I believed you." Thomas stared at her for a heartbeat, hope and wonder warring in his expression. Then he bent his head and kissed her, and this time it was nothing like their wedding kiss. This was deep and passionate and full of weeks of restrained longing finally released. Hannah melted into him, her arms going around his neck as he pulled her close against his chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Hannah, are you absolutely certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He kissed her again, softer this time but no less intense. Then he swept her up into his arms, just as he had that first day on the platform, and carried her to the loft. This time, there were no barriers between them, no careful distance maintained. They came together as husband and wife truly for the first time, tender and passionate and full of love that had been building for months. Afterward, Hannah lay in Thomas's arms, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to its normal rhythm. He stroked her hair gently, pressing kisses to the top of her head. "I love you," he murmured. "My brave, beautiful wife. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you are happy." "I am happy," she assured him. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," and it was true. This man who had rescued her from freezing on a platform, who had offered her partnership when she had nothing, who had been patient and kind and steady, had given her something far more valuable than security. He had given her love, real and true and deep, and she had given him the same in return. The months that followed were the happiest of Hannah's life. Spring came fully, transforming the brown landscape into an ocean of green grass dotted with wildflowers. She and Thomas worked side by side, planting a garden, tending the animals, managing the ranch. But now every task was infused with joy because they did it together, truly together, as partners who loved each other. Thomas taught her to ride properly, and they spent long afternoons exploring the ranch on horseback, sometimes stopping to make love in hidden groves by the creek. He was an attentive and passionate lover, and Hannah marveled at how her body responded to his touch, how natural and right it all felt. She also discovered new aspects of his personality as their intimacy deepened. He had a dry sense of humor that often caught her by surprise. He loved to sing, though he claimed he was terrible at it, his voice rumbling through old work songs as he did chores. He had a protective streak a mile wide and would not rest easy if he thought she was upset or worried about something, until he had helped solve whatever was troubling her. For her part, Hannah bloomed in the warmth of Thomas's love. She grew stronger physically from the work and the good food. She grew more confident, more willing to voice her opinions and desires. She laughed more, smiled more. The shadows that had haunted her eyes gradually faded. They made improvements to the ranch together. Thomas built an addition onto the house, giving them a separate bedroom and a larger main room. Hannah planted flower beds around the porch and made new curtains for every window. They acquired 2 more milk cows and expanded the chicken coop. Life was hard work, but it was good work, satisfying work. In late summer, Hannah realized she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening at dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, then a slow smile spread across his face, growing until he was grinning like a fool. "A baby," he said. "We are having a baby. Yes. Sometime in the spring, I think." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. "We are having a baby," he said again, as though he could not quite believe it. "Hannah, we are going to be parents." The rest of the evening was spent making plans and dreaming about the future. Thomas was already mentally redesigning the loft to make a nursery. Hannah tried to calm his excitement by pointing out they had months yet to prepare, but secretly she was just as thrilled as he was. The pregnancy was not easy. Hannah suffered from morning sickness well into her second trimester and found the Colorado summer heat oppressive. But Thomas was endlessly solicitous, taking over as many of her chores as possible, making sure she rested and ate well. He would sit with her in the evenings reading aloud when she was too tired to do anything else, his hand resting gently on her growing belly, marveling at the life they had created together. As autumn arrived and then winter, Hannah's belly grew large and round. Moving became difficult, sleeping nearly impossible. But every time she felt the baby kick, every time she saw the wonder on Thomas's face as he felt their child move beneath his hand, she knew it was all worth it. The baby came on a cold night in early March, exactly 1 year after Hannah and Thomas had first made love. The labor was long and difficult, with Thomas pacing anxiously downstairs, while the midwife from town, Mrs. Patterson, attended to Hannah in the loft. But finally, as dawn was breaking, a strong cry filled the air. "You have a son," Mrs. Patterson called down. "A healthy baby boy." Thomas took the stairs 3 at a time. Hannah lay exhausted in the bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was smiling as she cradled the tiny bundle in her arms. Thomas approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and squalling, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air. He was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen besides his wife. "Would you like to hold him?" Hannah asked softly. Thomas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Hannah showed him how to support the baby's head, and then his son was in his arms, light as a feather and precious beyond measure. The baby's cries quieted and dark blue eyes blinked up at him. "Hello, little one," Thomas whispered. "Welcome to the world. I am your father, and I promise to love you and protect you every day of your life." They named him Jacob Henry Keller, and he became the center of their world. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings even though Hannah nursed the baby, just to keep her company and help change him afterward. He fashioned a cradle from pine wood that he polished until it shone. He sang to Jacob every night, those same work songs, his deep voice soothing the baby to sleep. Hannah watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. Seeing this strong, capable man reduced to helpless wonder by a tiny infant, watching him kiss Jacob's fuzzy head and coo nonsense words, made her heart swell with more love than she thought she could contain. Life settled into a new rhythm, now dictated by the needs of a baby. The work of the ranch continued, made more challenging by interrupted sleep and the constant demands of an infant, but they managed. Thomas hired a young man from town, Billy Martinez, to help with the cattle during the busiest times, giving him more flexibility to assist Hannah with Jacob. As spring progressed into summer, Jacob grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, alert baby who smiled and gurgled at everyone. He had his father's eyes, that unusual gray-green, and his mother's delicate features. He was healthy and happy, and his laughter became the best sound in the house. One evening in June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Jacob dozed in Hannah's arms, Thomas turned to his wife. "You remember that first day?" he asked. "When you were standing on that platform, frozen and alone?" "Of course I remember. I almost did not stop. I was going to just ride past, mind my own business. But something made me turn around. I looked at you and I just knew I could not leave you there." Hannah reached over and took his hand. "I am glad you did not ride past. You saved my life that day, Thomas, in more ways than one." "You saved mine too," he said quietly. "I did not even realize how lonely I was until you arrived and showed me what it meant to have a real partner, a real companion. I was just existing before you. Now I am living." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors paint the sky. Jacob stirred and made a soft sound, and Hannah adjusted him gently in her arms. "I keep thinking about that moment when you said I would never be alone again," Hannah said. "It seemed impossible at the time. I had been alone for so long, I did not know any other way to be. But you kept your promise, Thomas. I have not been alone a single day since." "And you never will be," he assured her. "We are a family now. Whatever comes, we face it together." The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Jacob grew into a sturdy toddler and then a rambunctious little boy who followed his father everywhere, chattering constantly and asking a million questions. Thomas proved to be a patient father, answering every question seriously and including his son in as many tasks as was safe. When Jacob was 3, Hannah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Rose. She had her mother's brown hair and a temperament that was sunnier and calmer than her energetic older brother. Thomas was completely besotted with his daughter from the first moment, carrying her around in the crook of his arm as he did his chores, talking to her in a soft voice reserved just for her. 2 years after Sarah came another son, Peter Thomas, who proved to be the most adventurous of the 3, crawling at 5 months and walking at 9, giving his mother heart attacks regularly with his fearless exploration of everything. The ranch prospered as well. Thomas expanded the herd to over 100 head of cattle, acquired more land, built a proper barn to replace the old one. Hannah's garden grew larger every year, providing vegetables not just for the family but to sell in town. They acquired 2 pigs, more chickens, even a few sheep that Sarah delighted in caring for. The house expanded too, growing from the original single room to a proper multi-room home with a large kitchen, a sitting room, 3 bedrooms, and even a small room Thomas claimed as an office, but which inevitably became filled with the children's toys. Hannah furnished it gradually with pieces Thomas brought back from Denver or that they ordered from catalogs, adding comfort and warmth to what had once been a Spartan space. They became pillars of the Greeley community. Thomas served on the town council and helped settle disputes between ranchers. Hannah joined the Ladies' Aid Society and taught Sunday school at the church. Their children attended the small schoolhouse in town, riding in each morning with Thomas when he had business there, or in the wagon with Hannah when she went to shop. Life was not without its challenges. There were harsh winters when they lost cattle to the cold, dry summers when the creek ran low and the grass turned brown. There was the year when Jacob broke his arm falling from a horse, and Hannah paced frantically while the doctor set it. There was the scare when Sarah came down with scarlet fever, and they spent 3 terrifying days not knowing if she would survive, until the fever finally broke, and she opened her eyes and asked for water in her small, hoarse voice. But through it all, Hannah and Thomas faced everything together, their love deepening with each passing year. They still had their evenings by the fire, though now they often included children piled in their laps demanding stories. They still rode out together when they could, leaving the children with Billy's wife Maria for an afternoon to explore the land they loved. They still made time for each other, stealing kisses in the barn, holding hands at church, lying wrapped in each other's arms on cold winter nights. Hannah sometimes thought about the girl she had been, standing alone on that platform in the freezing cold with nothing to her name and nowhere to go. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. She had been so lost, so broken down by life. She had thought her story was ending when she stepped off that train in Greeley. Instead, it had just been beginning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Hannah back to the train station. The children were at home with Maria, who had become almost part of the family over the years. It was a cold February afternoon, much like the day they had met, though not quite as brutally freezing. They stood on the platform together, and Thomas pointed to the spot where he had first seen Hannah. "You were standing right there," he said, "looking so lost and cold. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even though I did not know it yet." "I was terrified," Hannah admitted. "I thought I was going to die there, and then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even thought to say." Thomas pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I am so grateful you got on that train. I am so grateful Gerald Morton wrote that advertisement and you answered it. I know that is a terrible thing to say, being glad about things that came from tragedy. But if none of it had happened, you would not be here. We would not have found each other." Hannah leaned into his warmth, looking out over the town that had become her home. "I believe we would have found each other somehow. I think we were meant to be." "I am not sure I believe in fate," Thomas said, "but I believe in second chances. I believe in taking a risk on a person even when it seems crazy. I believe in promises kept and love that grows over time." He turned her in his arms so they were face to face. His eyes, those gray-green eyes she loved so much, were serious and soft. "I love you, Hannah Keller. I loved you when you were a frozen stranger on a platform. I loved you when you were my practical bride of convenience. I loved you when you first told me you loved me back. I loved you when you gave birth to our children. I love you now, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. Even after 10 years, he could still move her with his words, still make her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. "I love you too, Thomas. You gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose, a future. But most of all, you gave me yourself. Your heart, your loyalty, your unwavering love. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." He kissed her there on the platform where they had met, a long, deep kiss that spoke of 10 years of love and partnership and the promise of decades more to come. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. They walked back to the wagon hand in hand, and Thomas helped her up to the seat. As they drove home through the familiar streets of Greeley and out onto the open prairie, Hannah looked over at her husband. His face was weathered now, lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun and wind. His hair had threads of silver at the temples, but he was still the strong, steady man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to live it. As if feeling her gaze, Thomas turned and smiled at her. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am, how grateful, how happy." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "The feeling is mutual, my love. The feeling is entirely mutual." When they arrived home, the children came running out to greet them, Jacob calling out questions about whether they had brought anything from town, Sarah hugging her mother's legs, and little Peter demanding to be picked up immediately. The noise and chaos of family life enveloped them, warm and wonderful. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Hannah stood at the bedroom window looking out at the moonlit landscape. Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You ever miss Philadelphia?" he asked. "The city, the culture, all the things you gave up to come here." Hannah thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if things had been different, but I do not miss it, not really. Everything I love, everything that matters is right here." She turned in his arms and kissed him softly. "You told me I would never be alone again, and you have kept that promise every single day. I do not just have you, I have our children, our friends, our community. I have a place where I belong. That is worth more than all the theaters and museums and fine society events in the world." Thomas held her close, and they stood there together in the moonlight. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of love and meaning from the rubble of their separate pasts. Years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Jacob grew tall and strong like his father, eventually taking over more and more of the ranch work. He married a sweet girl from town named Emily, and they built a house on the north corner of the ranch land, starting their own family. Sarah became a teacher at the Greeley school, patient and gentle with her students, just as her mother had been with her. Peter, true to his adventurous nature, spent 2 years working on the railroad before returning home and falling in love with Maria's daughter Isabella, bringing the two families even closer together. Thomas and Hannah became grandparents, then grandparents multiple times over. The ranch that had once been just the two of them grew into a sprawling family operation, with multiple houses and the next generation learning the skills and values their parents and grandparents had worked so hard to instill. On a warm evening in late summer, when Hannah was 53 and Thomas 55, they sat together on the porch swing Thomas had built years ago. Most of the family had gathered for dinner, as they did every Sunday, and now children and grandchildren were scattered around the yard, playing and talking as the sun set. Hannah leaned against Thomas's shoulder, content and peaceful. His arm came around her automatically, a gesture so familiar after more than 30 years of marriage that neither of them even thought about it anymore. "We have had a good life, haven't we?" Thomas said quietly. "The best life," Hannah agreed. "Better than I ever could have imagined that day on the train platform. You remember how scared you were, how cold. I remember thinking I was going to die alone in a strange place, and then you appeared and changed everything." Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You changed everything for me too. I did not even know how empty my life was until you filled it." They watched their family together, the product of their love and partnership. Jacob was teaching his oldest son to throw a rope, the boy's face screwed up in concentration. Sarah sat in the grass with her youngest, reading from a picture book. Peter and Isabella were trying to wrangle their twin boys who were determined to climb the fence. "Look at what we made," Hannah said softly. "Not just the children, but all of this. The ranch, the family, the legacy. We built something that will last long after we are gone." "We did it together," Thomas reminded her. "Every step of the way, partners just like I promised." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their grandchildren started to drift toward the house, called in by their parents. One by one, they came to hug their grandparents goodnight, small arms wrapping around necks, sweet voices calling out goodnight. After everyone had gone, either to their own homes or to the guest rooms in the main house, Thomas and Hannah remained on the swing, gently rocking back and forth. The night was warm and filled with the sounds of crickets, and a gentle breeze rustling through the cottonwood trees Thomas had planted years ago. "I would do it all again," Hannah said. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every fear. I would do it all again exactly the same way if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Thomas agreed. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Hannah Keller. That frozen girl on the platform turned out to be the love of my life." They sat together in the darkness, two souls who had found each other when both were lost, who had built a life of love and meaning together, who had kept the promises they made in a small church so many years ago. The ranch spread out around them, solid and prosperous. Their family slept peacefully under the same stars that shone down on the platform where they had met. Hannah thought about the words Thomas had spoken to her that first day, the promise that had seemed impossible at the time, but had turned out to be the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. She had never been alone again, not for a single day. And because of that, because of the love they had built together, neither would any of their children or grandchildren. They had created something that would endure, a legacy of love and partnership and family. That was the real happy ending, Hannah thought as she sat in her husband's arms under the Colorado stars. Not the wedding or even the falling in love, but this. The life they had built together, the family they had raised, the love that had only deepened and strengthened with every passing year. They had taken the broken pieces of their separate pasts and forged them into something beautiful and lasting. Thomas's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining automatically after so many years. She squeezed gently, and he squeezed back, a wordless communication of love that needed no translation. They sat together in perfect peace, two hearts beating as one, exactly as they would continue to do for all the years remaining to them. The wind rustled through the grass, and the stars wheeled overhead, but on the porch of the ranch house, all was warm and peaceful and full of love. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been meant to be from the moment a cowboy saw a frozen girl on a platform and made her a promise that changed both their lives forever.